Thank you all. I sometimes bring slides with me, but it'd be too much to ask, I think, this time of night to be following the slides. So what I will do instead, it has been said that I am a human chart, so sometimes I might be pointing up and down, so excuse it if it looks weird, but it's just to give you a feel for some of the big themes I want to talk about. Again, thanks for the introduction, Chris, and thank you for the invite. This is a bit of a challenge because you're looking forward to 2050, but I think the decade we're in is the decade that you're well aware that it's all on. So this is not just a transition decade. I think the last decade we've just had sort of socially, politically, economically feels like a mess because we haven't figured out what the new normal is. This decade is obviously the decade if we don't make some cut-through decisions, we're pretty much finished as a country, because I don't think a country like ours can survive 20 years of do-nothingness. And our history does tell us in the past when we did do nothing for about 20 years, it took us about another 30 to figure out what we'd done wrong. And that, I'm alluding to the first half of the 20th century when we ran high tariffs, immigration restriction, and basically a very, very inward-looking political system that got nothing done for about 40 or 50 years. And we needed to open the whole show up again to get going again. First thing I want to do is just go back six to 9 months to the last federal election and walk you through, this is the way I describe this election now to people, and just walk you through what actually happened as opposed to what the expectation was and what the surprise was on the night. So the expectation was a government that had already sacked itself twice by removing two of its prime ministers was asking to be executed by the public. That didn't happen. They ended up winning one more seat than they won in 2016, which suddenly transformed Scott Morrison into a miracle worker. But the interesting thing about that last election for me is the repetition of the result. So the election pretty much landed the same way as the 2016 election and the 2010 election. If you can remember back that far, that's the one where Julia Gillard was able to scrape together a minority government. And I'm going to rebuild the 151 seats in the electorate by place. And just to give you a clue that what's been happening in the last 10 years or so is people are no longer identifying in the way we used to understand them politically, that they identify by class, by economic or by social values. They're actually identifying by place. So people are voting according to where they live as opposed to who they are. And where they live defines who they are, not whether they're a worker or a small business person or a male or a female, a mum at home, a mum working, an older voter. A lot of those old categories which used to define political contests have slowly given way to this place-based voting. And the way I'll describe it to you is break the parliament down into about 5 constituent bits. So we'll start in the centre of the universe in Sydney, and we'll bring in a couple of other cities. We'll bring in Melbourne and Canberra, and let's call that the cosmopolitan south east. There are 50 seats in the federal parliament, so roughly 1/3 of all seats in the federal parliament are in these 3 cities, Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. If it was Melbourne, of course, I'd start in Melbourne. Now, out of those 50 seats, you'd think because the coalition won the election by a couple of seats that they would have done all right in those 3 cities. And it turns out that they were smashed across the 3 cities. Liberals only won 18 of the 50. There were 2 independents. There was a single Green and there was in Melbourne and there was Zali Steggall up here in Sydney. Labor won 30 seats out of the 50. So just hold that number in your head. 60% of all the seats in the southeast belong to the Labor Party, the party that lost the election. Take in 2 more capitals, Perth, Brizzy. These are frontier capitals. 21 seats in that parliament. Score draw. 11 Liberal, 10 Labor. Take in the 3 poorest capitals, Hobart, Adelaide, Darwin. There are only 9 seats between the 3 of them. Labor won 6 of the 9. Do you get the picture at the moment? Across the capitals, Labor win 46 seats. Across the 8 capitals. 46 Labor, only 31 Liberal, and there's 3 others. And that's more than half the entire Parliament of Australia. 2/3 of all Australians live in the 8 capital cities. So you have to think something weird has happened somewhere else. And I'll take you to your sector in a sec when you understand what happened somewhere else. Rest of Victoria and New South Wales. So regional Victoria, regional New South Wales, the electorates outside the capital cities. There are 38 seats in those two states. Again, score draw. 18 Labor, 19 Coalition, 1 other. Then take the rest of the poorest states and territories, so the remaining seats in South Australia, Tasmania and Northern Territory. The repetition, you don't need the individual numbers, it's just the repetition of this particular story that should be drilled into you by now. Again, score draw. 3 Labor, 4 Liberal, 1 other. So I've now counted 125 seats in the federal parliament out of 151. I've got Labor at 67, Coalition at 54 and 5 others. That is plus 13 for Labor in a head-to-head with the Coalition in every capital city in the country and in 2 of the territories and in 4 of the 6 states. So how does Scott Morrison win a majority out of that? By pretty much winning every other seat that was contested outside of Brisbane and outside of Perth. And the most important one is Queensland, because regional Queensland has 20 electorates to itself outside of Brisbane. Coalition won 18. Basically erased the deficit in the rest of the country, forms government effectively in the region of 1 state, plus they pick up 5 in WA as well. And why is this important for this sector? You've heard a few debates in the last few days about how a couple of coal mining electorates in Australia should pull rank on every other constituency in Australia because theoretically they decided the last election. It's very difficult to imagine the 2020s being a decade of more than just transition, but innovation, if you've got a couple of seats in Queensland holding the rest of the country to ransom. Now, it wouldn't be the first time a narrow constituency told the rest of the country, it's my way or the highway. But the reason why I've walked you through the detail of this is that this election is repeated 3 times, as I mentioned earlier. Regional Queensland and regional Western Australia are so conservative now that it doesn't matter what happens in the rest of the country. Labor goes to a federal election, it starts behind by about 20 or 25 seats because of what's occurring in regional Queensland and in regional Western Australia. So what's the big thing that's changed in the last 10 years? There are 2 things to think about. One is the end of the mining boom, which suddenly takes WA and Queensland out of the engine room of the national economy to the slow lane. They didn't return to the middle, they went back to slow lane. WA, as we know, had a bit of a dip. Perth is losing more people than it's receiving now, whereas a couple of years ago there were projections that would have had Perth larger than Brisbane in the next 10 years. So WA and Queensland are feeling estranged from the national economic story. That southeast that I allude to, the place we're in now, but especially Melbourne, now I'll put my Melburnian hat on and walk you through what's happening in Melbourne. Melbourne, to a lesser extent Sydney and certainly Canberra, are the engine room of the national economy at the moment. Last 10 years since the end of the GFC, since the end of that sort of windfall part of the mining boom, those 3 capitals are booming in a way that they've never boomed outside of the post-war migration program. So just in the last 10 years, Melbourne added 1 million people to its population. It went from 4 to 5 million in the space of a decade. No other cities up until this point had added 1 million in a single decade. 1 million people, right? Sydney added another 800,000. The reason why Melbourne's growing larger than Sydney at the moment is that Sydney still loses net about 20,000 people a year to interstate migration. Essentially refugees from your property market down here. For the Sydney-siders, you understand what the transaction is. That southeast hasn't been able to pull rank on the nation electorally for the last 10 years. Now, in the past, if you could get a majority of seats in Melbourne and in Sydney, you formed national government. Robert Menzies did, Bob Hawke did, Malcolm Fraser did. But you're not able to do it at the moment because of this wedge with the regions to the north and the west. But, and I'm alluding to the population story in the southeast and especially Melbourne, sooner or later there'll be an addition of another seat at the expense of somebody else in Melbourne. Melbourne picked up 1 seat in the electoral redistribution last year, should pick up another one at the next election. A couple of elections from now, and we haven't seen this since the end of the 1960s, a couple of elections from now I can humbly predict that Melbourne, not Queensland, decides a federal election. Now just think about it in terms of your sector. Suddenly conversations that aren't possible now become very front of mind because you'd think having been picked on for the last 30 years, Melburnians are copping a lot because they haven't been able to not just be able to decide who runs the country, but apparently they're too socially progressive. Apparently they're a little too evidence-based. Apparently they wear skivvies. Apparently they're fussy about their coffee. Apparently they like the wrong footy code. Those people are in a position to decide governments in the next 2 terms simply because of population growth. The flip side of this is the reason why Queensland has been able to pull rank on the rest of the country is the preceding 30 years of internal migration made those regions a lot larger relative to the other states. So here's the human graph part to it. The big story of the post-war period, the 50s and 60s, was really the boom in the outer suburbs, mainly Melbourne and Sydney, to a lesser extent Adelaide. Elections were decided in the southeast simply because that's where most of the punters were. And you had Menzies pretty much running the country for 2 decades because he spoke to suburban values of families with young kids and small business people, which are a constituency much larger than Labor's male blue-collar constituency. From the disruption in the 70s, especially through the 80s and the early 90s, we had a number of recessions in that period, from 72 through to 1991. There's a big drift north and then later west in the population, and that shifts the electorate north and west. What I'm arguing, and what I want people to think about, is in the next 10 years, because of the way the population story is moving in the southeast, we are going to see some of that electoral redistribution coming back south. So that's just simply a numbers game. But the difficulty behind those numbers, and these are the things I want to now go do in some detail, is what's driving population growth in the southeast. Where is, and I'm going to use the term energy not in terms of your sector, the energy in the economy is in the southeast for what reason? It is fundamentally driven by overseas migration. Now that extra million that Melbourne have picked up between 2008 and 2018, which is the most recent period we've got data, that's the period the Australian population moved from about 21 odd million to 25. Melbourne's 4 to 5, moving from 4 to 5 million was a quarter of all the national population growth in just the one city. If you add Sydney to it, you get half the population growth in Australia has just occurred in 2 cities in the last 10 years. Brisbane, which was in a position to be quite a significant force in its own right, is tapering off. The rest of Queensland is tapering off. Melbourne this year is, for the first time in 30 years, larger than all of Queensland as a population centre. Within the next 5 years, at the rate Melbourne's growing, it'll catch and pass Sydney and become the largest city in the country again. Now, as I said, I'm alluding to the fact that what's driving the growth is overseas migration. It is the #1 preferred destination for Indians, and the thing that's pulling them more than anything else, apart from job opportunities, is education. Now, we can have conversations about the immediate term about what happens to the sort of profile of the Chinese migration wave, but the more fundamental story in terms of what Australia is going to look like in the next 20 and 30 years is that the southeast will be the first part of Australia that switches from Anglo-European to Eurasian identity. And the reason why I say that is in the data at the moment, I can count myself finally in my late 50s, I'll pretend I'm in my late 50s, finally a member of the majority of the Australian population. Wasn't when I was born, certainly wasn't going to school. But the majority of the Australian population today is first or second generation migrant. Majority of the population today is not distributed according to those sums. The majority of the population, first and second generation migrant, is more like 2/3 in Sydney and Melbourne. Most other capital cities, apart from Perth, are at 50 or under. Brisbane is under 50%. So the majority of the population of Brisbane today still is third generation or older. And when I describe Eurasian Southeast, what I'm actually referring to is the specific ethnic face of the city. Largest immigrant group in Melbourne today are the Indians, and the second largest are the Chinese. Nationally, the English are still the largest immigrant group. But in Sydney, it's the Chinese with the Indians second. So those 2 cities, the only 2 cities in Australia that have Chinese and Indians 1 and 2. 2/3 of all the Indians and 3/4 of all the Chinese in Australia live in just Melbourne and Sydney. And there's been 1 million of them, 500,000 each from each country, that have arrived since 2001. And they're just concentrating in those 2 cities. It's obviously where the jobs are, it's obviously where the tertiary places are. Now, think about a country that becomes so urbanly focused. It's got 2 global cities pretty much dictating economic terms to the rest of the country, but in the short run still can't govern the country, i.e. it can't elect a government in its own name. When the moment comes when it can, and that may be in the next election or the election after, pretty much every policy that doesn't seem possible today suddenly becomes very possible. But rather than being an urban optimist, a cosmopolitan optimist, I want to now walk through why this particular scenario concerns me in the next 10 years. I know we need to shoot to 2050, but at the moment I just want to focus on the next 10 years. If most of the energy is in the southeast, and a lot of that energy is cosmopolitan, and it's migrant, but the rest of the country looks nothing like the southeast. So when I look at Brisbane today, which is barely half the entire population of Queensland, because it's still a very decentralised state, the largest immigrant group in Brisbane are the Kiwis. They're number 1, and the Poms are number 2. Remember, Indians 1, Chinese 2 in Melbourne, Chinese 1, Indians 2 in Sydney. When you duck across to the top of Australia, to Darwin, migrants from the Philippines are the largest ethnic group. In Perth, it's the English, and the South Africans are in the top 5. They're not in the top 5 anywhere else. In Adelaide, it's the English as well, except their median age is above 60, and more are passing on or moving out than are arriving. That country is going to be a very difficult country to hold together, because up until the last 10 years, it didn't matter whether you're a large migration centre or very Anglo, the migrants landed in roughly the same order. It didn't matter where you were. It'd be the English first after the Second World War, followed by the Italians. In the 70s, the Italians would be replaced by the New Zealanders, and at the turn of the 21st century, the Chinese replaced the Indians. And so that hierarchy was pretty much everywhere. So the national snapshot was the ethnic face of the capitals and the regions. The national ethnic face today looks nothing like any part of Australia outside of Canberra. Canberra's about the only city that looks like the nation at large. It's a really weird stat, and it's temporary. It's a transition stat. Sydney and Melbourne, as I say, are Eurasian. The north of Australia draws a fair bit of its migration, apart from internal migration, from the Pacific, and the west, for some reason, is harking back to the mother country and to South Africa. When I look at the electoral map and then I put the ethnic face over Australia, that more than anything else explains to me the difference in voting behaviour. Now, it's possible that the Liberal Party will one day look at this and decide to get the suburbs back. Now, it doesn't really matter who figures this out first, but the first party that can break that place divide and build a new majority is going to have to govern on behalf of the cities. Now, in the cities, of course, where all the revenue is generated, you have a danger of a different kind of winner-take-all. Because the moment you think of those 2 regional seats in Queensland, pulling rank on the rest of the country, no one's ever been able to tell me which 2 seats they are, but theoretically there are a couple of seats that will always get another coal mine going if you give them enough money. Think about how difficult it would be to govern a country if it's a cosmopolitan majority and it's winner-take-all for not just people with jobs, but people who pay taxes. So if most of your revenue is generated in the southeast and your recipients are in the north and the west, at the moment the system kind of works because your recipients of welfare get to decide who governs us. When you move to a situation where your winners... So one way to think about it is what would have happened in the US if LA and New York were 40% of the population, which is what Melbourne and Sydney are to the Australian population. You'd never get a Trump, right? The Republicans would basically say 40 of the 50 states in America are completely disempowered. They're poorer, they're whiter, they're less educated than the East and the West Coast, but those guys get to run the country. That would be a bitterly divided country. I don't see as radical a scenario for Australia, but I do see a danger that in the next 10 or so years, your country's run by people who are okay, who are doing okay. Now, when we were sort of prepping for my presentation, one of the scenarios that was just sort of thrown across the table, I won't say who told me this, but it's an interesting thought. Sorry, Rosemary, I'm pointing at you. I look at, as I say, I'm not trying to divide the country up, but if we think about it in terms of the balance sheet and your revenue your revenue's coming out of the southeast and your recipients are in the north and the west, and you put infrastructure in the centre of those two, of that T-chart. Infrastructure and the decision of where to spend and where to invest isn't necessarily dictated, shouldn't be dictated, we know, because of a north-south divide or a south-east-west divide. It should be dictated by the obvious thing, where your best rate of return is, where the gaps in service delivery are. But it's possible, if you're getting your elections decided by people like us, for once, that we may decide to hoard all the benefits on our behalf. So one of the scenarios, and Rosemary did sort of mention this, I don't think it's not an actual recommendation, right? You probably don't even remember mentioning this. She was wondering about a scenario in the future where Melbourne and Sydney basically paid everybody else's electricity bills or energy bills. And then that be, whether that's an agent of cohesion or whether that's some way to get the safety net back up and running, it actually was quite an interesting lateral thought. But the reason why I worry about not that thought, the reason why I worry about that scenario is if you're putting all your migrant winners in the southeast, and I always think about this in terms of my own sort of cohort. My parents, fairly typical post-war migrants, Greeks, Italians, former Yugoslavia, the 10-pound POMs, all basically came from the same socioeconomic position. Either they're coming from the regions of the Mediterranean or they're coming from the cities of the UK, but they started towards the bottom of the ladder. And we measured their success as sort of new Australians in terms of home ownership, small business. It's their kids, their Australian-born kids, through their university experience and their sort of work in the professional sectors, plural, where you measured a two-generation success story for migration. Pretty much every migrant that's arrived on a skill visa since 2001 hasn't started where my parents started. They've started where theoretically people like me ended up, but they start there on arrival, middle or the top, and they're clustering in Melbourne and Sydney. And they're creating a sort of integration challenge like no other that we've ever had before, an integration challenge about why would they bother to be anything more than here for the lifestyle or here for the opportunity to then hop to another country when they get a better offer. These are questions that should be exercised in the minds of sort of government officials. I tend to think that you'll get integration on completely different terms. You'll have to get the integration on the new arrived migrants' terms, not through the second generation, which is through the kids of migrants, which is the way we used to do integration a lot slower. Tease the parents on the way in, tease the kids at school, and then decided they were real Australians when they topped the class. That's not the equation we're looking at now. And the reason why I keep harking on this is that if your skilled migration program is supersizing your populations in Melbourne, places like Melbourne and Sydney at the expense of the rest of the country, and it's creating a virtuous growth cycle that keeps these two cities pretty much globally viable, but the rest of the country, A, doesn't look like those two cities, and B, doesn't feel like their kids have the same opportunity, you're beginning to divide a nation in a way that you haven't divided it before. And the challenge of pulling it together is much more difficult than the challenge that we have up until this point. The challenges up to this point is make sure that everybody gets free health, hopefully not blow their household budgets on education, make sure the infrastructure gives you equivalent services all over the country. That's what you have. That's what you have Premiers conferences for. I don't think we call them Premiers conferences anymore. The difficulty comes in the next 10 years when the southeast, which is paying revenue, starts to pick up the signal from the north and the west that they don't want these people here in the first place. But you're on the receiving end of benefits. Why would you pay taxes to deliver a benefit to somebody who doesn't want you to be here in the first place? Integration challenge. It's a big integration challenge. It's not one politics thinks about readily, but it's a big integration challenge. But then, of course, if you try to deal with the integration problem by bringing especially Chinese and Indian migrants straight into your boardrooms and, with a small lag into your parliament, it doesn't fix the other problem, which is that the rest of the country doesn't recognise how quickly we're changing. Well, it sort of senses we're changing quickly, but it doesn't feel a part of it. Now, the way the federal budget's structured at the moment and the way the federation is structured at the moment, the Commonwealth runs around telling everybody that it can do micro-transactions now because it no longer pulls any levers. You know, officials don't fix the exchange rate, we don't have tariffs, we don't have centralised wage fixing, we don't have a regulated financial sector. Of course, the states no longer run the energy market, allegedly in the taxpayer interest. You've got a federation where the Commonwealth collects a lot of money but doesn't have many responsibilities. So rather than trying to fix national problems, it starts to target micro problems at an electoral level. What was sports rorts about? But by the way, sports rorts are $250 million and they're just the two we know about. $250 million in an election year is a lot of money to dole out, but it also tells me that federal politics doesn't have its eye on the main game. It's again very difficult to imagine a transition to a whatever version of the 80s we're looking for in terms of public policy with that political class, given the divisions that are emerging. It's very difficult to imagine that they have the nous to be able to keep bridges built between cities and regional centres, and between cities, by the way. I think I might let Chris come up and, when I find him, I might let him come up and ask some questions on scenarios. I quote this particular stat, and I will take you to Melbourne now for this one. There's a very interesting thing that's going on between Melbourne and Adelaide, which is, and we all know South Australia is sort of near and dear to our hearts in the energy sector because it apparently was a canary that toppled over and has changed your world in the last 3 or 4 years. Is that the best way to put it, or have I got it wrong? I vaguely remember Malcolm Turnbull going crazy about South Australia a couple of years ago. And then there were a whole lot of interventions in the market, and then he lost his job for different reasons, or maybe related reasons. I also remember Jay Weatherill and Josh Frydenberg having that joint press conference. I remember Jay literally bit, even though he's supposed to be the canary, he literally bit Josh's head off and swallowed it whole and still answered a question that wasn't asked of him. So Adelaide, to all intents and purposes, is now the first capital city that's beginning to look like a regional centre in Australia. It's fast approaching the point where there are more people aged 65 and over than under 15. Now just think about that in terms of your service delivery and your ageing scenario, your ageing population scenarios. Adelaide's 1.5 million. We know that Melbourne's at 5 now. On a cold start, I assume no overseas migration for Adelaide. The population of Adelaide either stagnates or falls by a couple of hundred every year because more kids leave Adelaide than the city generates through net natural addition. So on a cold start without overseas migration, Adelaide's population stagnates. And that is a regional town scenario. And this is a city of 1.5 million people. In Melbourne, by the way, close to 6,000 people a year leave Adelaide in net terms to go to places like Melbourne. Melbourne picks up about 10 to 15,000 people from the rest of Australia in any given year. It also has 10 times as many babies each year as Adelaide does. Their birth rates are both pretty low, but there's still a lot of people in Melbourne, some of them apparently having babies. So the question then, once you've put those two things into the calculator, how does Adelaide grow? It can only grow from the overseas migration program. And pretty much every place outside of Brisbane can only grow in Australia at the moment through the overseas migration program. More than 50% of the population growth comes from overseas. 110,000 migrants choose either Melbourne or Adelaide, chose either Melbourne or Adelaide in 2018. So for Adelaide to keep up with Melbourne, it needs about a third or close to a half of that. It only got 10,000, Melbourne got the 100. So in the next 10 years, let's assume low growth scenario for Melbourne. Basically the last decade repeats the next decade, not an escalation, which is possible. They add another million, they go from 5 to 6. In that decade, Adelaide adds 100,000. It goes from 1.5 to 1.6. That's just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the shift to the southeast. every question you've probably ever thought of in terms of how you maintain the viability of national markets needs to take into account how quickly the country is changing and how quickly the parts of the country that are functioning are separating from the parts of the country that are stagnating. Now, stagnating is not meant to be a term of derision or a term of endearment or anything. It is just what it is. And one last thought, of course, this was obvious to us theoretically about 20, 30, 40 years ago. And Lynn has got a couple of years on me, but she was in Treasury in the 80s, and I was a young Canberra journalist in the late 80s. And one of the things we were really fretting about theoretically in the 80s was the ageing of the population. That little trigger year, which is around 2011, when the first of the baby boomers turned 65 and exited the labour market and didn't have enough money in their superannuation accounts, so they'd go to the age pension. And there are all these theoretical constructs about the age dependency ratio and the like, and how would you be able to fund a country with a larger share of people retired on a smaller working age population. So that was the theory in the 80s and 90s, and of course a lot of that debate was done theoretically on the assumption of slow population growth in Australia. It didn't consider the possibility that the migration program after 2001 would soup up and you get a literal doubling each year in the number of permanent settlers. And they'd be coming from two nations rising in our region, China and India. None of those scenarios were thought of then. Now, the ageing equation becomes now very complicated because in a place like Melbourne and Sydney, most parts of Melbourne and Sydney now theoretically are younger today than they were in 2001. And they're younger because their working age population is bulking out because of migration and because they're sending retirees to the coast. The coastal areas are not getting overseas migrants, they're losing their kids to the city and getting retirees in return. So you've got these big migration waves, but it's the cross currents of interstate migration that are making the regions much older, much faster than whatever national snapshot would tell you. A national snapshot will tell you half the population is born overseas, and the top 5 groups are the English, the Chinese, Indians, the Kiwis and the Philippines. But the Sydney and Melbourne snapshot is 2/3 are born overseas, and the top 2 groups are the Indians and the Chinese. A national snapshot will tell you that we're still relatively young, say compared to Europe, and certainly compared to Japan, and certainly compared to China. But a city versus region snapshot will tell you that some of our cities are younger than they were 20 years ago, and our regions are much older. And there are some regions in Australia that look like Japan. So, as I say, I don't mean to bring you down after the first Chardonnay or champagne, but we do want to future-proof this country. And one of the things I think for the people in this room is to think about how do you keep a country that's changing that quickly together? How do you maintain cohesion? And it should be front of mind in a public policy sense, because there's no point waking up, on election night when Anthony Green calls it at 6:30 and says, "Oh my God, every one of the seats in Melbourne and Sydney has gone this way, and it doesn't matter what happens everywhere else." There's no point thinking that that's the day that things improve. That may well be the day that we fall off the cliff in terms of our social cohesion, because having come from Melbourne, I'm not confident that Melburnians are of a mind to share the bounty when they finally get to run the place.
That's brilliant. So before I ask George a couple of questions, just to build on that, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So I guess we've got another challenge. We've heard today we had what's the point, household consumers coming out of the household research. I'm stuck from business and thinking about how we redress that. I think we've now got a new one that goes to pulling together or even holding together. I think the 2050 that you are pointing to, George, is potentially a 2050 that looks more like the US now.
Yes.
Obviously a big problem. So I guess is what can we do to try and keep people together? One thing I wanted to do, just to get George to reflect, is play a video. And I can see our AV guys springing into action. This is, and I'll just pause for a second just to introduce it. We've got a number of people from the Sydney Alliance here. I'm sure you've met. I think Twee is here. We've got some leaders from the Sydney Alliance community in the room as well. We've got one down here. I saw a couple of others as well. But Twee took us out to speak to some of those leaders late last year. And I'm just going to play an interview that we did because I think it goes to the heart of this pulling together, and particularly in a community that faces a whole heap of extra challenges to those of us essentially in this room. But the leap from solving a practical challenge for people into some of the bigger picture issues around pulling together that George has pointed to, I think is quite profound. And particularly, George, in the context of what you talk about in the football solution and the safety net and trust, it just seems to be a great launching off point for the conversation.
Thanks.
My name is Sheikh Adid Al-Rubai, and I am the Imam of Muhajirin Association and the representative for the Grand Mufti of Muslim Australia, and I am involved with the community because I am the spiritual leader in this area. The difficulties that my community face because of the energy bills, it's two things. One of them is to understand the bills, to read it, understand it. Secondly is the chasing for the debt collectors, and they always threatening them. We will put you on the blacklist, we will cut that, we will do that. So they really terrifying from that debt collectors. So they came to my association, my office, our role to be a medium between the people and the debt collectors and the energy providers themselves. And sometimes we get some discount from the debt collectors because we know how to talk with them. It's my role, my friend. It's my role as a spiritual leader for this community, as a Muslim community, to help the people. Besides, teach them the principles of the religion. One of the principles to help others, the needy, not necessarily by money, by removing the difficulties from them. That's the major role for me. Honestly, the future for the energy for Australia, the short future, I don't find any light in the end of the tunnel. But maybe in the future, when the three parties cooperate sincerely for the benefit of the Australians, the government, the retailers, and the factories who produce, when they cooperate sincerely, I think in the far future, not now.
So I think Sheikh Adid, George, is pointing to a similar future you are, and probably from his experience on the ground. But I wonder if you could reflect on that video.
So there was an interesting, I'll start with his observation at the end about, I think he means all parties, but also business and consumers. And I assume he also means all levels of government putting their heads together and figuring out how to solve what is an energy riddle. Is probably the best way to describe it. Now, I'm always interested when I hear it from someone outside the system, the idea that experts and sectors with government are collaborating, because it seems intuitive, it seems rational, it seems the normal way of doing things, but we know that we haven't been governed that way for quite a while. And when I describe the electorate splintering by place, it actually removes the incentive for collaboration for both sides of politics. And because the way politics has been conducted at a federal level, and to a lesser extent more recently at the state level, but you have a very, very tribal situation where if one side comes up with an idea, say a carbon tax or an ETS, the other side, on coming to government, feels duty-bound to have their sights set on the rear vision mirror, which is about undoing what the previous government had done. Now, at a state level, we've seen a bit of this. So I'll quote you a Victorian example, because Victorians do like to see themselves as exceptional in the policy space, but they've been behaving just as rattly as anyone else. We had going in from the Brumby government to the Napthine government, a infrastructure project completed, which was a desalination plant, and the incoming coalition government said they wouldn't draw a drop of water from it, simply because the other side had come up with the idea. That government got thrown out after a single term. Remember, we were in a one-term government phase pretty much everywhere for a little while in the early part of the last decade. The incoming Labor government had on its in its in tray the deal on the East Link, which is a big road project in Melbourne. And they looked at it and thought, well, the other side have come up with this idea. I don't feel obliged to honour this contract. So they spent $1 billion to not proceed with that contract. They basically paid them out $1 billion and then switched. They went from road to rail. This sort of whiplash across, and we're talking in the service provision space, this sort of whiplash is a really, really tricky thing because it's in the mindset of both sides of politics. So they contest an idea to the point at which one side is exhausted. There's only one example in the last 10 years I can think of that came outside of the parliament that both sides of politics have pretty much signed up to, and that's the NDIS. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme is the beginnings of the collaboration model, but it's a collaboration model that started outside the government. And that's it obviously puts a big onus on a room like this, that whatever policy breakthroughs you're looking for have to pretty much start in the sector. And they have to start, by the way, in collaboration. So the model has to be a collaborative model. So that's where it makes more than intuitive sense, because his view from the ground is, I can't get anything done if nothing's going to happen in the short term for my constituency if all I'm doing is negotiating with debt collectors. Because that seems to be, at the moment, he's doing a good job. Yeah. And he's also educating his consumers, but they've got no power as a collective group outside of his representation. So that will be my takeout based on the collaboration that he alludes to that we haven't had for quite a while. But what was the 80s model and what was the post-war reconstruction model? The 80s model was really from a position of weakness, try to get the economy opened and get it going again. We had bipartisanship agreement on what the problem to be solved was, some debate about which levers to pull, but we had business and we still had a trade union in those days in collaboration. The better example, by the way, is the post-war reconstruction, and that was across both sides of politics. It went from Curtin to Chifley to Menzies, and a bureaucracy in that era that was sort of coming into its own, and industry bodies and the trade union movement were...
So is that I mean, that makes... The concept of a compact has come up a couple of times today, George. I mean, is that how you would describe that coming together?
Well, it's happened twice before. It's happened once in a booming population scenario, which is the post-war reconstruction with a big mass migration program, and it happened once from a position of weakness, which is in response to the stagflation of the 70s.
So that's compact in a context of transition as well?
Yeah.
I know you've written about that. They don't...
This one at the moment, we've basically got a post-war scenario going in terms of population growth in some parts of Australia. We've got an 80s scenario going in other parts of Australia, which is how do you pick people up off the floor. And you've got new shocks, and you mentioned climate change. This is the ultimate known unknown, isn't it? Whatever the development footprint and the ecological footprint in Australia today is, this is probably as good as it will be for the next 20 years. So collaboration is, it sounds like a easy thing to direct people to do, but in terms of institutional biases at the moment, they're not capable of it. The only other lesson I draw from that sort of post-war and the 80s experience is it came after some serious shocks. So you had a generation raised on depression, Second World War, a generation raised on, the model no longer working in the 70s. So the shock now is climate change. But it's a question of when it becomes accepted on both sides of politics. Because what will happen based on previous experiences, once politics accepts the need to act, they realise that they're very quickly out of their depth in terms of the tools. Because it certainly can't be delivered out of a couple of bureaucracies with a couple of announcements from a couple of politicians.
So one more question, and I think I'll bounce off some of what I'm seeing there, and it really goes to, I guess, well, what role can government and the media, but maybe all of us, play in trying to bring people in a context of diverging interests? George, if there's one thing people should take away, one of your books they should read, what is it?
Actually, I mean, you don't need to be a footy fan to read the footy book, but the footy book does go to how a community projects onto this thing called a football club and addresses a lot of the problems, a lot of the concerns that it can't address through government. through trade unions or, say, through the churches. So trust in institutions is down across the board, but this thing called a football club has suddenly realised in the last few years, and they're not the only ones that have realised this, that people identify with this thing and they don't just want to win, they also want to be represented. They want their players to be good citizens. So the lesson in that is not so much how good are footy clubs, it's that in the community there is a sort of need, an aching for being represented, and also a need to have different groups be able to feel comfortable in the same space. So I always quote micro detail, but it's an important detail. There's 6 players that polled votes for best on ground in the 2017 grand final were the son of a Maori, a Muslim Australian, an Indigenous Australian, an Italian Australian, a Jehovah's Witness, and a teenager from the north of Adelaide. So no footy club has ever looked like Australia quite like that footy club looked like in 2017. Most of the problems we have, such an interesting question, most of the problems we have in politics is the monoculture within the tribe. Most of the difficulties we're trying to solve out there is the complexity of environmental shocks, technology shocks, demographic shocks, and demographic shocks are twofold, ageing plus diversity. But you've got systems basically built on a winner-take-all model in a situation where most institutions are not trusted in the first place. Dog is chasing its tail at the moment. So the lesson would be, how do you build a community of interests? And a community of interests in this sector is clearly, and in fact I would try and make it ground up from the consumer up and then drag the drag the industry with you. But you know, their interests are your interests in the long run, aren't they? They want stability.
That's brilliant. Well, I think that's an absolutely fantastic note and a very hopeful note to end on. Can you all join me in thanking George? That was absolutely fantastic.